Hi class, welcome to chapter 14. This is the second lecture in the fourth unit of this class. And if you recall, we left off in chapter 13 with talking about how a population can change over time. So how can certain allele frequencies change given certain selective pressures. So those traits originally arise through mutation. And it's possible that over long periods of time, those mutations accumulate and lead to a change in trait. And then that trait can be selected for either through the environment, through natural selection, or through artificial selection through humans. So all of chapter 13 was really about what we call microevolution. In other words, relatively small changes over relatively speaking short periods of time. And so it's important to understand that when we say a short period of time, we're not talking about 5 minutes or even 5 years. We're really talking about millions of years. So in an evolutionary context, 1,000,000 years is really not that long. So when we talk about a long time, we're talking about 100 million years, for example. So really kind of reset your time clock when we talk about short periods of time and long periods of time. So let's remind ourselves, here's just a quick, we had these little comprehension questions when we were in class, so I thought I'd keep some of them in this lecture. And ask yourself, what is the term fitness? What does that mean in a biological context? We use that word all the time in our everyday language, but it means something a bit different for biologists. What does it mean? This is a good, I like this question because, again, when we think of fitness, we think of the ability, even if well, first of all, the common, right, normal people, remember, we're not normal, we're biologists. So remind yourself, and you're one of us now, so you can't take it back. But for normal people, fitness means like how healthy you are, right? How can you do an aerobics class? Can you climb a flight of stairs without breathing heavy? Are you in shape and so on? Like, we have these kind of common conceptions about what that term fitness means. But even if you think, even if you're thinking in terms of biological context, a lot of people will pick answer A. It means that your ability to endure, right? Like the stability in the face of environmental change. So if you have the ability to survive, that means that you have fitness. And while that's kind of true, a better answer really is B. Because that includes survival, right? The ability to contribute your alleles, in other words, your genes, to the next generation means that you survived to sexual maturity, that you are fertile, that you can have offspring, and you're giving those offspring a good chance of surviving. So the ability to contribute your genes on to the next generation is considered fitness in a biological context. All right, so remember that natural selection has 3 different kind of outcomes. We can have directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. So during a drought, it was discovered that finches with either large beaks or small beaks were more successful than those in the middle. So which of the selective processes is taking place here? So in order to visualize this, we can kind of make a graph where we have the x-axis, remember, is going to be beak size. And this is going to be the number of birds that have that particular beak size. So on one end, we're going to have small, this is a terrible graph, right? I'd give you a 0 for this if you're turning it in for your, for your lab report. So we have, on one end, we have a small beaks, and on the other end, we have big beaks. And so let's just assume that we have a typical distribution of beak size. We really have no idea what it is, but let's just imagine that our original population, let's see if I can make dashed lines, looks something like this. So the majority of birds had a normal, what we're going to call medium beak size. The majority of these birds had a medium beak size, but after this, a drought, for various reasons, probably having to do with food, due to food sources, small beak size and large beak size were selected for. So it's possible that we see a small peak, it goes down, and then we see another peak because more birds are going to have small beaks and large beaks, and this population of birds died, right? The birds with medium beaks didn't do very well during that drought, and so they didn't pass their alleles on to that next generation. This is disruptive selection. This is actually the beginning of speciation. We can talk, which is what we're talking about in this lecture, but we're starting to see a divergence in this population. We're having birds that have beak size get bigger and birds whose beak size are getting small. So the population, the character, this particular character, large, smaller, medium beaks, is getting disrupted. Okay. So I mentioned these two terms in the intro, microevolution versus macroevolution. So remember that microevolution is simply a change in allele frequency of a population over time. And so we usually call this microevolution or simply change in a population. Now, on the other hand, macroevolution, another term for it is speciation. In other words, the generation of new species. And this is ultimately how we get diversity on our planet. This is our working model for how life arose on this planet. How did we get all of these different life forms over time? Well, it was through this process of speciation. Both of these are evolution, of course. One, they contain the word, certainly. So, and they're both change over time. The difference is, of course, the degree of change and the scale of time. So microevolution, small changes, smaller, remember, let's just say 1 million years or less. And whereas macroevolution is going to be large enough changes to consider it a different species, and very, very long periods of time. If we were in class, we'd spend actually quite a bit of time on this. And I think I have an Amoeba sister video on speciation or defining a species. And if you think about this, seems like something that's very obvious to people. We all know how species are separate, and we can identify one species versus another. At least we think we can. But once that definition starts to get questioned, it can become quite tricky because there are so many exceptions, and it can be very difficult to understand what the difference is between two seemingly different animals that are in fact the same species and animals that are the same species that look very different from one another. So we would spend a little bit of time and talk and discuss how we would define a species. Of course, since we're not doing that discussion, we're gonna skip right over that. And go ahead and we'll skip to the idea. It's like some of the more commonly accepted ideas of some of the more commonly accepted definitions of what a species is. So we tend to use in biology, we tend to consider the biological species definition of what makes a species. And so the biological definition is a group of populations, so we're talking about different groups, and those members can actually interbreed from one another. So we have basically gene flow, productive gene flow occurring within those populations. And not only do we have gene flow occurring, but they produce viable offspring and so viable basically means that they're healthy and they can survive, and also that they're fertile. And this becomes an important part later. And then just to kind of cover all of our bases, the other kind of leg of this is that they cannot breed successfully with members of other species. So just hang on to those kind of couple of exceptions and we'll talk about this. This is, believe it or not, these are two different birds. Again, I'm going to talk about my bird expertise here for what it's worth, but this is the meadowlark, and on the right, this is the, oh, is it the right one? It is. This is, no, this is the, they can get confusing. This is the eastern meadowlark, and this is the western meadowlark. In the United States, we have this big geographical barrier called the Rocky Mountains that does a pretty good job of separating bird populations. And so you'll see a lot of speciation occurring with birds, basically the Rocky Mountains west and versus the Rocky Mountains east. So for example, the eastern and western meadowlark, the eastern bluebird versus the western bluebird. They're they're similar, they look a lot alike, but they're in fact two different species because their populations don't interbreed with one another because they don't cross the Rockies. Okay. Now, this biological species concept has some challenges. So there are some limitations to this definition. First of all, it's very difficult to prove what fossils could interbreed with one another and which fossils interacted with which population. So it's a really difficult definition to prove going back in time. So we can only use current data to look at breeding success and interaction success. And then of course, don't forget, I have to remind you of this because they're my favorite thing, that prokaryotes, bacteria, archaea, and a lot of eukaryotic organisms as well, which constitute, you forget this, but they're the vast majority of species on this planet, reproduce asexually. So we can't ask that question, right? Can this bacteria mate and produce offspring with this other bacteria? Because they don't do that. They just divide in two and make more bacteria. So we can't apply this fertility concept to organisms that reproduce asexually, either by fission or by budding off or fragmentation, all those other weird things that those prokaryotes do. The other issue, of course, is that gene flow can in fact occur. It's rare, but it can in fact occur between two different, what we thought of as two different species. A perfect example is the grizzly bear or brown bear. Are grizzly bears and brown bears different? I feel like they might be subspecies of one another. But let's just hear, because our animation that you do for the lab talks about brown bears. And I want to say that they're the same, they're considered the same species. So grizzly bears and polar bears have long been considered different species. They certainly have different traits and different habitats and so on, but they can interbreed. So there is some evidence of gene flow between these two populations, and they produce viable offspring, and they're called Gröhler bears. They really look like a mix of both of these species of bears. So how do we define this species? Are they in fact two different species? Are they separate? Are they the same? Are they subspecies of one another? Who knows? So there are other definitions. Remember, I mentioned that there's at least a couple dozen different ways to define species, depending on what branch of biology or genetics you're kind of studying. A morphological species concept would group animals based on their morphological similarities and differences. Whereas an ecological species concept would say that the species that live in the same ecological niche, in other words, have the same kind of specialties and live in the same habitat, would be considered similar species. The phylogenetic species definition is interesting because it basically says that a species is the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor. So in other words, it's the last branch on a so this is as we're defining and classifying organisms, right, we can kind of break them into smaller and smaller groups. So here we have an order of carnivores, and then this branches off into cats, Felidae. These are like weasels and skunks, and I think otters belong to this group. And of course, Canidae is our dogs. So as we continue to branch and branch and branch and so on, each individual branch would be considered a species. And there's a lot of overlap, of course, with that one and the biological species concept, but there's exceptions too. So how does the process of speciation occur? So what are the mechanisms that will lead to isolation of populations and therefore start that population on a journey towards speciation? Well, the big difference is the big barrier, the big mechanism is reproductive isolation. In other words, they're going to separate that population into two different populations, and that now, because those two populations don't interact with one another anymore, of course there won't be any kind of interbreeding and there won't be any more gene flow. And there's two kinds of reproductive isolation that we can talk about: prezygotic and postzygotic. So let's talk about what these two terms mean. prezygotic barriers essentially means everything that happens before fertilization takes place. This is one of the interactive videos that you click through on the lab, and I think there's, I forget how many they go over in the video, but our book has 5 different types of prezygotic barriers. So if a population is separated through their habitat, and we see this all the time, I think I have some examples in the preceding slide. So basically, they become spatially separated. So there's a barrier in between them. A fence goes up, a mountain range goes up, or the fish species gets somehow put into 2 different lakes, from which they can't leave. Right? They're becoming isolated from that other population, and that is a barrier to reproduction. On the other hand, we can have temporal isolation. So this occurs for when certain populations become, how would I say, maybe a population, a portion of that population becomes more active in the morning, whereas the other portion becomes more active at dusk. And so they slowly over time change their habits, and they're active at different times of the day or night. It's also possible that their behavior can change over time. This is usually manifested in sexual selection. So the mating dance that they use, or the coloration that either females or males could select for, and so on. I think the example in our lab are the fireflies. They have different patterns of blinking. they're of lighting up, and based on how they light up, will attract a certain kind of mate. So behavioral isolation is a common mating tactic, and or mating mechanism, I guess I should say, and that can lead to speciation as well. We can also have mechanical isolation, where essentially the interacting bits become incompatible. This is really common in plants and different kinds of shellfish, where basically they don't, oh, how would I say this? They don't, not sure how to explain this exactly. Like one of the common ways in plants is that the pollen can't get to the pistil, the female part of a plant, due to the way that the flower is arranged, or so on. So there's something kind of structural about those 2 populations that don't allow them to mate. And then finally, we have like basically genetic incompatibility or gametic isolation, where we have the 2 gametes, right, the egg and the sperm, for whatever reason, become less compatible with one another. So I think sea urchins, the gametes have a protein coat that surrounds the gamete, and it doesn't allow certain sperm to penetrate that cell membrane. The proteins kind of repel certain species of I shouldn't say species, certain individual sperm. And you can imagine how that would lead to speciation over time. So again, everything up to prezygotic right here, right? We have, it's pre-fertilization. In other words, it's preventing these 2 individuals from mating successfully and creating fertilization. But there are some post-zygotic barriers, and basically post-zygotic barriers mean that, yes, they can have offspring, so fertilization can successfully occur, but for various reasons that the offspring don't really work very well. So the example that we watch in a video are the salamanders of California, in that hybrid region in the Palo Bar Mountains. That hybrid salamander isn't very successful at surviving because it's not well adapted to its range, right? It's a cross between 2 different subspecies that have both adapted very differently over a really long period of time. So these salamanders aren't well adapted to the area in which they live, and therefore they're not viable. On the other hand, we can have offspring that are truly, well, I shouldn't say, they're fine, they're healthy, but they can't, they themselves can't have offspring. So they're infertile, and so the evolutionary line would stop with that animal. So a perfect example of this is is it a mule? A donkey? Yeah, I think a donkey and a horse, right, has a mule. And mules are great. They're good animals, but they're infertile. And finally, we have hybrid breakdown, where the hybrid is okay, but the offspring of the hybrid is infertile. So hybrid breakdown is when it can have one set of offspring, but that offspring can't in turn have offspring. So pre versus post-zygotic barriers. Guaranteed question on the test, right? I'll give you a particular kind of, I'll describe a situation to you, and you'll have to pick whether it's pre-zygotic or post-zygotic, and then which of the examples it could be. I should have went to the next, I should have went to the next slide to describe all these. So here's all the examples of the pre-zygotic barriers, most of which I just talked about. I should say most of, all of which I just talked about. Okay. So ask yourself what the answer to this question is. So hopefully you recognize that temporal isolation would lead to a reproductive barrier. If one group within that population is active at dawn, whereas the other one is more active at dusk, we could see reproductive isolation start to occur within this population. And so it's a timing issue, right? Some of the animals are active in the morning, others are more active in the evening. So it's a temporal isolation, A. All right, so we need to fit three, we need to meet three, what's the word I'm looking, criteria. We need to meet three criteria in order for a new population or a new species to arise within a population. So we have to have reproductive isolation from some other portion of that population. So here we have a portion of it looks like beetles. Somehow they become separated, whether it's geographic, temporal, behavioral, and so on. And over time, again, time with a capital T, they're going to evolve independently from that other population. So they may have different selective pressures put on them from the environment. If you recall the pocket mouse, right, some of them live on the lava flats with dark fur, and others live on sand with lighter fur. So they could have, they're basically going to have different selective pressures occur. And because of that, they're going to accumulate changes to those allele frequencies. Remember that our allele frequencies are going to change over time, and which ones are successful depends on our environment. And so that change in allele frequency is going to eventually lead to different phenotypes. And over a very long period of time, these two populations can't recognize one another as self, essentially, right? They can't recognize the other beetle as someone that they could mate with and have successful, viable offspring with. And we now have speciation that has occurred. There are two modes, so different mechanisms, or two processes that can, through which speciation can occur. And it really depends on how the initial gene flow has stopped. So remember the first criteria, let's go back, right? The first criteria here is that they have to be isolated from one another. So how does that isolation occur? The first one is called allopatric speciation. And allopatric speciation is when we have a geographic barrier that occurs between these two populations. So I think there's an example. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. There's great examples here. So I'm not going to go too far into it. So in other words, the population that used to be one has been separated into two because of space, right? There's some space or some barrier that has been put between these two, and they can no longer interact with one another. Now, so if this doesn't occur, the only other process that can through which speciation can occur is called sympatric speciation. And this is when essentially we don't have a geographic barrier. So we could have sexual selection occurring in plants. We can have polyploidy occur. I'll talk about what that means. Or we could have over a period of time habitat differentiation. So their choice in food or the choice during what time of day they're active occur. So basically we have, I kind of think of this as one thing. Like, so if we can either have allopatric speciation, which is a geographic barrier, or everything else, and that's sympatric. So let's talk about some examples of allopatric speciation. So here we have two different species of, these look like chipmunks, but I'm pretty sure they're squirrels, which is weird to me because they look exactly like a chipmunk looks in the Midwest. Are these, let me look it up in the book. Do they have it? Because I would swear those things are chipmunks. Yeah, they're antelope squirrels, which I disagree with. I guess the book knows. They should look like chipmunks to me. Anyway, so these squirrels, the antelope squirrels, live in the Southwest, and they have been separated by the Grand Canyon, which is a pretty good geographic barrier. So let me ask you, what would the Grand Canyon, what types of animals would it not be a barrier to? Hopefully you recognize that it wouldn't be a barrier for birds, right? So birds have all kinds of interesting, birds are a fun thing to study because they are so much more mobile than other animals. So very small animals, animals that like live under rocks and hidey holes, right? They can get separated from one another quite easily because, you know, for them, a mile is an unimaginable distance, right? But for a bird, a mile is nothing. So we have these two antelope squirrels. They've been separated by the Grand Canyon. One lives on the north rim, one lives on the south rim. And I have no idea how old the Grand Canyon is, but it's pretty old. Let me see if there's an answer in here. North rim separated. The Alpheus, nope. No, they don't say in the book. So over time, some period of time, again, really long time, because speciation takes a really, really long time to occur. These two animals diverged from one another because they were separated geographically, which is allopatric speciation. I think we have another example. Yeah, so we had all these different, I think these are called tiger shrimp. Interesting example, snapping shrimp. And so there's lots and lots of species of these shrimp. They're really interesting because they have beautiful coloration, and they're easy to identify based on their colors. And oh, how long ago was it? So here's Panama, the country of Panama, and it's also called the Isthmus of Panama. So an isthmus, not only is it very hard to say, but an isthmus is a narrow land bridge that separates two bodies of water. And this wasn't always there. This used to be one big ocean. And I want to say that the Isthmus of Panama is only about, I think it's only like 5 million years old. It's really not that, it's pretty new in terms, you know, in geologic time, 5 million years, again, isn't that long. And so this separated that population of shrimp. So we have one that's in the Atlantic, several species, I should say, because I think there's like several, I want to say there's like 3 dozen species of this type of shrimp. And so some of them are stuck on the Atlantic side, some of them are stuck on the Pacific side. And then of course, what's really fascinating is that we now have that Panama Canal, which is very slowly reintroducing species from one side to the next. So until we had this gene flow that can occur through the Panama Canal, we had a geographic barrier, so we would consider that allopatric speciation. Now, sympatric speciation in my mind, because I'm not an evolutionary biologist, is really difficult to explain because, well, it's just complex. I mean, you know, just like this is easy. Like they're separated. They can't get to each other, right? So they're going to develop differently because they can't interbreed. Examples of sympatric speciations are more complicated and are thus harder to prove. So there's a type of fish called a cichlid. I want to say, I know the majority of them are in Africa. I know that there are other, I think there's cichlids in other parts of the world, but they're really cool fish because there's lots and lots of species of them, and they're very brightly colored, and they're very easy to identify based on their coloration. And so there's a lake in Africa called Lake Victoria, which is a really, really cool lake, and it's huge, and it has a lot of really diverse habitats within that lake. And so if you think about a really big lake, like like the Great Lakes in here in the United States, there's all different types of habitats that have different temperatures, different oxygen levels, different little ecosystems of communities of animals that are living in them, and so on. And so this is kind of like what Lake Victoria is. So there's these two species of cichlid, Pundamelia and Nairei, and these have separated over time through sympatric speciation, because essentially what happens is the males, I guess, undergo sexual selection by females. The females prefer brightly colored mates. And in the more shallow areas of the lake, the females, the light can get through the shallower water easier. So the females have selected for more, I think it's a blue, a type of blue mate, males. Whereas the deeper you go in the lake, the water becomes more monochromatic, because it basically gets filtered out by bumping into all the water molecules as it makes its way deeper into the lake. And what that does is it tends to make everything one color, and it's just usually like this red-orange color. So in deeper areas of the lake, we don't have this sexual selection occurring. So we can see that even though they're in the same geographic area and they can, in theory, interbreed with one another, but because the way that the light allows the female fish to perceive their mates, they're selecting for different colors of sexual partners, so undergoing sexual selection because of their preference for brightly colored males over more dull colored males. So this would be sympatric speciation. Now, before I talk about this example, we have to have a minute here, because this took me a while to wrap my head around too. Remember that polyploidy, we're diploid, right? Our gametes are monoploid, haploid, right? So one N. And then when they come together, they form a zygote that is 2N, in other words, diploid. And all of our cells, of course, are diploid. We're 2N. So 1N is haploid, 2N is diploid. Did I say that wrong? 1N is haploid, 2N is diploid. And then anything above that is polyploid, many. And depending on the species, they have some type of ploidy that's specific to each species. We're, of course, 2N diploid, but other species have other copy numbers of their chromosomes. The problem, of course, is that they can't have a different number. And in animals, that leads usually to, how would I say it? The fetus or the zygote is not viable. It dies because it can't handle having too many chromosomes. It turns out that plants are perfectly okay with this. They don't mind being polyploidy at all. The problem is that once it becomes polyploidy, it can't mate with members of its species that don't have the same chromosome number. So if we have an error occur, so we have, this is wheat, triticum is the scientific name for wheat. And so we have these two wheat species, or wheat plants, these individuals, and they, produce an offspring that has too many chromosomes. And it turns out that this this plant can then self-fertilize, and we get a new species just like that. And because, again, remember, species can't, this guy can't interact with any of the other plants. And so he's now, this plant has now become its own species. So this happens. I'm not explaining this very well. And again, you don't have to know this for the test. I just want you to appreciate that polyploidy in plants is a pretty rapid method of speciation in plants, because it turns out that plants are okay with being polyploidy, and as long as they can survive and self-fertilize, because remember, plants can also self-fertilize. So a plant can take its own pollen and fertilize its own I feel like you don't call them eggs in plants, but its own, gametes, and produce offspring. So one other method of sympatric speciation. Okay, another one that I want to, what's wrong with my pen? There we go. Okay. Another one, the last one, I think this is the last one. Yep. The last one that I want to talk about is habitat differentiation. So the original, a tree that's native to many parts of the United States are hawthorn trees, and they produce these kind of fruits. I don't think that I feel like they're not edible. I'm pretty sure they're not edible, at least for us. But they are edible for this certain type of fly. And the fly the fly will, I think, put their eggs, right? They'll deposit their eggs, and then the maggots, the larvae or the maggots or whatever they're called, will eat the fruit of the hawthorn tree and undergo their metamorphosis or whatever into flies. So that happened for a really long time. Europeans came over, colonized the New World, North America, and with them they brought apples. Apples look a lot like hawthorn trees, and certainly the fruit do. And so some of these flies started laying their eggs on the apple trees. Well, apples, Apples flower and fruit much earlier in the year versus hawthorn. So the flies that would lay their eggs on the apples did it a lot earlier. So they started to, because they had a different, I guess for lack of a better word, food source, they started to change their habitat. And eventually we now have two different species of flies that can get onto hawthorn, flies that basically utilize hawthorn trees as their egg laying choice, and flies that utilize the apple trees as their choice for egg laying. Another example of sympatric speciation. And you can imagine that the selective pressures on flies that utilize the apple tree versus the hawthorn tree become different. Or are different, I should say. And so now that fly population, or in this case, these fox populations are separated, they have different selective pressures placed on them. Maybe it's different food, different weather, if they're geographically separated, the type of habitat that they have to survive in is different. And eventually, again, over a very long period of time, they're going to become reproductively incompatible for all of those pre- and post-zygotic reasons that I mentioned earlier. So this is a great, this is the slide that I want you to think about when you watch the salamander video on the California salamander, because this is basically what happened. We had this species of salamander in Northern California. And as that salamander made its way south, one species went along the coast and one species went through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And they ended up here. I like this story because we can actually see these salamanders both of them in San Diego County. And they're considered, they're considered two different species, right? We have one, I think this is the one that's mostly black and it has the big yellow splotches on it. And then this guy, he's the one that tries to look like the newt. So he's bright red and he acts like he's poisonous, even though he isn't. So he's a mimic. And so they both had different selective pressures, right? This one evaded predation by being camouflaged. This one here that moved along the coastal mountain ranges evaded predation by acting like it was poisonous, even though it wasn't. And so that divergence will create two different species, species number one and species number two. And occasionally we see this hybrid zone, and we actually see this, right? We see this in the Palomar Mountain Range where we have that hybrid salamander that is a result, that's an offspring of mating of these two species. And but they're not viable, right? They're not well adapted. They stick out like a sore thumb. They're neither a good mimic nor good camouflage, so they get preyed upon quite easily, and they just aren't, they're at this point anyway, not surviving. And so we call that zone where these two species can potentially meet a hybrid zone. Okay, so speciation patterns. So how does like again, over these millions of years, how does that change occur? Does it occur fast, or does it occur slow? Or does it happen all at once, or does it happen gradually? Well, there's two different patterns of speciation that we use as a model. The first one is called a punctuated pattern, where basically we have a very large change occur within a relatively short period of time, and then we have no changing occurring over a very long period of time. So that's called punctuated equilibrium. Another pattern is called gradual, which, as you can imagine, basically this means that we have gradual changes over time that accumulate, and only after, so again, there's not, right, no big changes between these individual, I mean, we can bear, right, they're very subtle, like what's the difference between these two? What is the difference? I don't know. It's very, I don't know. They look the same to me. But again, small changes over a large period of time, but it happened gradually, as opposed to here where it happened all at once and then we don't get another change for a very long time. So the gradualism model that I just mentioned was the model that was first proposed by Darwin. And it's the most accepted model, and I think there's solid evidence for this change. This is also the model that is supported by a lot of DNA evidence. If we look back and do DNA sequencing on animals for which we can get their DNA, we can see this gradual change, a gradual accumulation of mutations and allele frequencies and so on, that leads to this gradualism model. But the punctuated equilibrium, so in other words, fast and then nothing, has been put forward by other famous evolutionary biologists. And this also has a little bit more support in the fossil record. So it's very, very difficult to find transitional species. To be fair, it's very hard to find fossils, period. But it's very difficult to find these transitional evidence of slow transition. So what we do see is, like, we see speciation occurring very quickly in terms of the fossil record. So it's quite possible that both of these are occurring. And for some changes, it's a gradual model. For other species and other speciation models, it's a punctuated equilibrium. All right, let's ask some content question. Read this question and see if you can figure out the answer. Okay, this is an interesting question. So let's talk about, let's separate these two answers. And let's first ask ourselves if it's allopatric or sympatric, because it's got to be one of those two. And remember that allopatric means geographic isolation. Do we have geographic isolation occurring here? Absolutely we do, right? They are a distance apart by which they can't overcome. So they've been separated from the original population through geography. So we can clearly say that this is allopatric speciation instead of sympatric. But now let's look at these other two, divergent versus punctuated. Over time, island is much hotter, drier. Okay, so over time, I would say, I think this is the key phrase, right? Over time would tell me, oh wait, what is divergent speciation? That's not even a thing. What am I doing? Yeah, it's punctuated or gradual. Yeah, there's no punctuated versus, yeah, this isn't even a term. And it wouldn't be punctuated because it happens over time. Okay, good. That confused me because I knew that these two terms were linked. A and B are two different terms, and then I was like, what is going on here? Okay, good. All right, so the answer here is A. There's no such thing as divergent speciation. All speciation is divergent, and punctuated speciation, again, that can occur, that's something that occurs very rapidly, and we have a quick change, over a short period of time, evolutionarily speaking, as opposed to a gradual speciation model. All right, speciation, or the form of new species. Oh, this is a good one. I like this question. So the correct answer here, and I think I might have briefly mentioned this at some point, but this is how we got life on this planet. And so the current idea is that we all have the same grandpa, and this has led to all of the different species that are present today. And we're all related, and there's lots of evidence for this. There's very strong fossil evidence for this. There's really good DNA evidence for this. And we are all unified in our diversity, right? Unity in diversity. So we have this crazy diversity of life on this planet, but we ultimately all came from that same original ancestor. That does it for chapter 14. I'm going to quick do 15 today too and get that up for you as well. Good luck. Let's see. I'll just discard those guys. Uh-oh, where's my guy?